So the big kind of question for biological anthropology is what makes us us, right? And the idea of life on the planet evolving and changing, um, we have to understand that change is actually constant. And the idea of why we're obsessed with finding when modern humans came to be, many of these have to do with our worldviews, our ideology, our religious ideology, but also fundamentally, kind of humans have the ability to imagine. So the imagination leads us to curiosity, to ask questions, and to want answers to those questions. Really, that whole combination of what I just described is essentially one of those things that sets us apart from many of our ancestors and relatives. Many people believe that that ability to imagine and tell ourselves those stories about imagination um, actually is what separates us from Homo erectus in a large degree, but also maybe even Neanderthal. So one of the things is that Neanderthal doesn't even travel as far as Homo erectus. But Homo sapiens take that adventure gene or the curiosity gene or the imagination gene, whatever you want to call it, to an nth degree of um, exploration, right? To the point where we've gone to the moon and now we're trying to go to Mars. So all of those things are a part and parcel to us even asking these questions of what makes us us. To be honest, my own biased opinion is that I think it's fascinating to ask the questions and go through that process. But I think asking the question in this binary framing creates a then binary answer, which is, oh well, us started at this point, right? Which is what we've done in the past in anthropology, where we essentially ask ourselves, well, when did we start? Where did we come from genetically? And then we say, well, we started here, and then it looked like this. Well, what we've found is that essentially it's just so messy that to try to describe any one category ends up putting us in a more of a description of analysis, right? And what that looks like is uh, our categorization is simply if you look at a tree and you say, well, that's a tree, right? It's broad, and then you move on. Well, what does the tree have? Where did it come from? What were its relatives, right? What did its root system look like? Um, Describe it, descriptions, those kinds of things are that gray area is really where we're moving into, to be honest. And my own bias is that I think that that's actually more valuable than pointing out specific things, and it's because people really also, not only do we have the imagination to kind of move forward in things, but we also have an imagination to move backwards, and tell our own history and our own story. And I think a lot of times that can be divisive. We've used this for things like racism and some of these other things, and I think that that's very divisive and non-productive. So essentially, saying that humans are just this messy, kind of muddy group of genetic misfits, to be honest, that ended up having the right, or not even right, but the environmental adaptations biologically to survive the way that we have, is in that descriptions of those processes are probably more valuable to us as a species, to be honest. When we get into that divisional stuff, it just ends up seeming to cause more problems. And really, what we get into with this is again, more questions, but that's fine. I think that asking questions is great. However, when we get into answers, that becomes much more of a political and academic kind of journey, to be honest. Remember, in academia, many individuals are essentially trying to get tenure, they're trying to write books, they're trying to get jobs at universities. So, what ends up happening is individuals in the field are almost forced to pick a side in order to argue it and make a justification for it, so that they can essentially rise to a position in academia. Whereas, and that in itself is a structural kind of issue. But when we kind of branch out further than that, we start to get everybody kind of picking all of these different sides and critiquing each other to make a place within that academic world. And then they just end up proving each other wrong over time, which is a fascinating thing for me. I mean, for me, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I can kind of sit back and watch this as a cultural phenomenon, to be honest. And I'm not necessarily needing to put things into boxes. And if you need to put things into boxes because the Western binary thought structure works with you and it's how we organize our thoughts, this is totally fine. I'm not judging it. For me, I'm okay living in that gray area, and I think that, to be honest, many anthropologists are moving to that level of description rather than categorization and determination, right? Which is essentially, this is how it is, this is what it looked like, and this is why I've probably said throughout the class that the dates don't move forward; they move backwards, right? So, and you guys kind of watching these videos and reading these articles that I've posted have probably realized that, wow, when a new finding comes up, then we have to kind of go, oh well, this is now 7 million years old, and this also looked like a relative of Homo sapiens back in the day, right? So again, this is very much one of those things. So the idea of demarcating us, right? Like, where did we start? Is a very difficult question. Because if Homo erectus and Homo habilis before that, and Tacadensis and Tuganensis are before that, it's well, what are we? Who are we? How do we delineate and decide what we are, right? And I think that that's a difficult thing. A lot of times, people even do archaic Homo sapiens and then modern. Well, archaic Homo sapiens have been here for quite a long time, right? And then we have modern that have been here for 250. Well, what is the real difference there? Is it environmental, where we lost our brow ridge and our noses changed because we're moving into Europe and some of these other areas? We ended up interbreeding with modern Homo sapiens anyway, with archaic. So what is us? It's just so messy. And so one of the things, and I'll tell you that this Romanian site, 41,000 years ago, is the first site where modern Homo sapiens are found out of Africa. I put this on here to actually prove to you that this is according to a textbook that happened a few years ago. This has already been proved wrong. There are now sites in Europe that have been proved that Homo sapiens moved out 100,000 years ago, if not longer before that. So this is essentially a date that doesn't really necessarily work anymore. But I'm pointing out how essentially these things come about. People create their whole careers on it. Look, we found a Homo sapien, skeleton, and essentially this is the first one that we can say, and that we found in Europe, and so therefore this is when people left. Well, people keep looking. We find more skulls. We find more skeletons. And osteology evidence, and again, what we end up finding is that no, they actually left a lot longer than that, a lot further back in time than that. So again, I think this is just kind of this gray zone part of the conversation I wanted to share with you. Modern humans, in terms of the field, right? They're going to say that middle of wash, again, this comes up 200,000 years ago. This is kind of in this area of Ethiopia. Some, again, genetic evidence is looking at Sudan as maybe being a little bit further than that. So we have really in terms of our dating techniques are genetic evidence is a newer form of this structure. Before that would have been more the absolute dating, things like argon. And what we find is cranial capacity at 1450. I'll tell you right now that Neanderthals were more about 1750 cc's. So again, this is showing you what a modern cranial capacity looks like in association with some of our past. 90,000 years ago, Israel sites and East Asia date to 100,000 years ago. One of the things which is fascinating is that Asian archaeologists and paleoanthropologists have been saying for a very long time that they have evidence of Homo sapiens being in Asia 100,000 years ago, or if not longer. And European anthropologists or archaeologists and paleoanthropologists, biological anthropologists, essentially were saying, no, we don't necessarily believe that. That's not what our fossil evidence is showing. So you had kind of a debate in the field, and European and American biological anthropologists, archaeologists were in disagreements with the Asian community. And I'll tell you that again, to be honest, the Asian community is actually being proven right a lot more than over time than the European archaeologists would have wanted to admit. And again, this ends up being almost it gets turned into anyway kind of racial arguments and some of these other things. Every group wants to prove that they were the oldest for some reason, because then they could say that they're the original. And I think that this is one of those issues that I was kind of touching on earlier. Let's see. So again, these earlier dates, right, essentially are giving us pause for debate in the field. Modern human and culture. So humans, one of the big things that sets us apart is that fishing and aquatic resources become a big part of modern Homo sapiens diet. And a lot of people put this at about 60,000 years ago. And some people in the field even call this the cognitive revolution. So essentially, this is when we see Homo sapiens just doing cave art and making musical instruments and flutes that are all this amazing stuff. And a lot of people associate that with the omega-3s that are coming out of seafood and shellfish and some of those other things that they didn't have in their diet before. So they start to see an explosion in these things. What I will tell you is that Neanderthal had these things before that. Specialized hunting, right? So they start to use more raw materials for tools. We can start to see trade. We start to also see art specialization. So around this time period, we see division of labor, in that some individuals look like they were full-time artists, carving certain things, doing cave paintings, and then other people would have been gathering food for those individuals. So this is a big shift around how people were living, right? And again, the cognitive revolution, fire and cooking food, social change, but also fire had been used for a long time. But what they think around this is making music instruments and dancing and sharing food. This becomes really when Homo sapiens start to utilize the social structure that we currently see. So again, what's fascinating here is that for 250,000 years ago, essentially what we're looking at is Homo sapiens maybe operating more the way that Homo erectus or Neanderthal and some of the others would have, which would have been tight groups, but they might have not been engaged in music and dance and as much sharing and sitting around a fire and that kind of collaboration. So 60,000 years ago is really when we see mobile art and all of these other things really taking off. Now, again, what I need to tell you is that Neanderthal had a lot of these things prior to us. So again, for us, it was like, well, Homo sapiens were smarter because they had these things. Well, now we found these things in Neanderthal, that are stretching further back. So then not necessarily true. Something that may be true though is that our connectivity. One of the things that might have also been one of the traits that added to this was that Homo sapiens were more inclined to trade with other groups, which created more allyships and collaboration and cooperation with groups outside of our own. So it may have been that Neanderthal actually had more ethnocentrism, which is kind of their own bias towards other Neanderthals and other Homo sapien groups, where Homo sapiens were more inclusive of other groups, realizing that working together and collaborating is the key. And Homo sapiens, it looks like biologically, were picked for that reason. So in terms of sexual selection, they would have actually chosen individuals and mates based on these things, based on their ability to get along. So anybody who was causing problems and being kind of violent or outside of the norms would have been kicked out and not able to actually mate. So some biological anthropologists believe that that's a trait, a biological trait that had been removed from the Homo sapiens species through this group interaction process. Migration of other groups. We have land bridges, Homo floresiensis. You'll see a video on them. They're the hobbit humans. Microcephaly is the condition where the cranium is smaller and the brain is less developed. They originally thought this about Homo floresiensis. However, it's not true. And you'll see the video. They're 3 feet tall, but they're anatomically kind of more like Homo erectus, Australopithecines meets Homo sapiens. So it's very complicated and convoluted, to be honest, at this point. Native American individuals had what you see the teeth here. They're shovel-shaped teeth, incisors, and it's a dental trait from kind of Asian and Native American ancestry. Paleo-Indians are the earliest hominid inhabitants of the Americas. We get Clovis. It's the earliest Native American culture in North America. However, this is being pushed back. So this date about 12,000 to 14,000 years ago when they were hunting mammoths, they thought this is the original connected to the land bridge and connected to the megafauna, the giant mastodons and mammoths and giant sloths and whatnot. And essentially, we have found that those dates of Folsom and Clovis are being pushed back. So again, I sum this up. There is a combination of multi-regional and out of Africa.